Hi, I'm Mark Lawson, president of MorningStar Music Publishers, and we are very happy to have a chance today to visit with Terry York, who is professor of Christian ministry and church music at Baylor University's George Truett Theological Seminary. Terry has just written a new book entitled Let Our Words Become Flesh. It's a collection of words for worship. I want to start by having you give us a little bit of an overview of what's in the book, and then can you address a little about how you decided on this title?
The premise of the book is to look into worship wherever it may come down on the free church to liturgical scale, to look at our worship and to see where are words at play, where are words at work and dynamic, and how might we heighten the congregation's expectation of how words function. How can we heighten the congregation's openness to embrace these words? So the book has benedictions and other kinds of prayers. It has litanies. There's even some things to say, to think about in a child dedication, whatever that looks like in any given setting. And then there's poetry in it as well. So there are benedictions, blessings, litanies, wherever words show up, we're going to go there, take a look at them. And then this book offers then some examples as well that can actually be used directly in worship or can serve as templates or patterns or for each congregation to write their own, which I came to the title very simply out of John, the Gospel of John, chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and then that's verse 1, and then in verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It's talking about Jesus, and Jesus is our example. We pray and we trust that worship will transform us towards Christ's likeness. So if the Word became flesh, if we are little Christs and we're to be more Christ-like, then our words perhaps might become flesh. I don't think that's too much of a stretch, but anyway, that's where it came from.
So this book is obviously meant for those who plan worship, whether it be a pastor or a music director. How do you best see it being used?
Now, yes, this is first and foremost, I suppose, for worship planners and worship leaders. And hopefully they would see very quickly ways that this can be used. But I think it's not limited to worship leaders and worship planners. I think it also could get into the hands of what I might think of as being very thoughtful worshipers. Whether that's a tradition or a denomination or just two or three people in a congregation for whom the words really matter, this could help them. I also think it could be very helpful for the choir. There's a devotional time for the choir as a whole, or if the individual choir members are encouraged to have their own devotional time, I think this book could do that very well. Also, I think if this book were used purposely at the beginning of a rehearsal, it could tune sort of a word awareness, the same way we tune our tonal awareness. We have vocal exercises and warm-ups to get our ears tuned to pitch and to balance and tonality. What if we also took time to tune our hearts and our ears toward word awareness? So words aren't just holding a spot for a note, but words are doing work as well. Could we heighten our awareness for that, like we heighten our awareness for the tonal? So I really believe that could happen.
And I think one of the other things about it is, after having read the book and been involved with it, particularly the benedictions that you do, I keep thinking of as we end a choir rehearsal and we say, okay, folks, well, see you next week, that the more pronouncing almost like a benediction or a blessing on people as they leave has a very strong and meaningful context.
And my hope at that point would be that the choir director could find the pieces actually in the book to be a place to start, could be very helpful. And then again, maybe it spawns within that choir, within that congregation, they write their own. And maybe go back and forth from what's in the book to what they write their own. That there's enough teacher in me that I watch for that as well. Say, okay, here's the lesson, here's the example. Yes, let's learn these, but now can you do your own work? And I think that would be wonderful if the choir got that aware of words and they started creating their own as well.
Yeah, I agree. So I found a lot of this book to be so interesting, but some of the most compelling things for me were things that grew out of your own personal experiences, like prayer that you prayed after the 9/11 tragedy, and things that you've said at funerals, or prayers that have grown out of maybe political upheaval or something like that. Talk about a little bit about your process that you go through when you're asked to do something like that and how it formed this.
Well, my immediate thought in situations like that, like our pastor after 9/11, he called a special prayer meeting that night, as guess everyone did. And he asked me to pray a prayer, a specific prayer. And there are other settings, as you've mentioned. Where I go with that is to start with the fact that I'm praying to God. But on behalf of these people, God is going to be listening, but so is the congregation. So while God is the primary reason for praying and to whom and the primary audience, still there are other people not only listening, but looking to be pulled into it as their prayer as well. My process is to go to a keyboard and just write a flow of thought. Here's all my thoughts about like 9/11. Here are all my thoughts about this, and a wide gamut of responses. And I try not to edit in my head or not to edit in my heart. I try to get all those thoughts on the screen and then stand up, sit back down, and now edit what's on the screen. Still with in mind, this is to God with a congregational responsibility. But that's how I approach it. All the things that I want to say. Now, how much of that is mine and very personal? How much of that makes sense in a corporate setting? And then I do that kind of work. What's difficult, Mark, is to not edit in my head and not edit in my heart as I'm doing this, to get it on the screen and then edit it. But that's how I go about it. And I want the prayer to be both vulnerable and authentic.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that you've done is you've brought a real honesty into the prayer in much the same way as I read some of your prayers. I couldn't help but think about the honesty of the psalmist,
Yeah.
sometimes saying, I'm angry, sometimes saying, I'm hurt. That's not something we do very much in corporate prayer these days, is to admit that we're maybe angry
Right.
or hurt. But your prayers take on that kind of characteristic, and I appreciate that honesty in it.
Thank you. Yeah. The lament, we all know how rare lament is, and even confession in some traditions, but how rare lament is. And that kind of honesty to say, I know of a church after 9/11 that their worship service the next day had components that was, for instance, saying to Satan, if you will, to evil, a mighty fortress is our God. No. We need to tell God, hey, remember, you're our mighty fortress. And to be that open, to be that honest before God and say, this hurts. It's hard to follow you right now. I don't understand it. But that we're to worship in spirit and in truth. And that's the truth. And the spirit can handle it. And so that's where that comes from.
Well, I think we both kind of grew up in traditions that didn't necessarily always use scripted words, or maybe they were even suspicious of too many scripted words. When did that change for you?
It was kind of a process, and dots started to connect. It first started to change for me when I saw us practicing over and over and over and over choir anthems that had scripted words. And then when I learned that hymns function, among other things, as prayers, scripted prayers, just we're singing it as prayer. So those dots start to connect. And then when I got into college and beyond, and became aware of the Book of Common Prayer, and I read prayers centuries back that were as fresh in their application as anything I could have written that day. I said, okay. And then I get this theological thing. To God, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. So it's all being written and prayed now. So those dots start to connect for me. And the more it connected, the more I internalized that. Even Jesus in the Lord's Prayer, The Lord teaches how to pray. So, well, first make sure you do this and then you do that. And no, he gave them words. And in the Our Father, the fact that Jesus used words here, say this, said to me, I think it's okay. So those things all started to come together, and not only made me feel okay about it, but invited me into writing prayers that had that kind of, or at least stretched toward that kind of timelessness, but born out of the moment.
Yeah.
So it's kind of those things all finally finding each other and those dots getting connected.
I can imagine that this book will open up points of dialogue about worship planning. How would you suggest, or do you have any tips? Because you've been on both sides of that. You've functioned in pastoral roles and musician roles. How do you suggest that there's conversations about how to use this?
Well, I would hope that there would already be in any setting some sort of conversation between, shall we say, the pastor and whoever is in charge of the music. That there ought to be some kind of conversation about what direction are we going to go, whether it's around a lectionary and liturgical calendar, or whether it's a calendar that a particular denomination puts together. But there would be some sort of reason for these folks to visit with each other. If there is, then maybe this book can come at that meeting and give some fresh ideas and some fresh encouragement. If there isn't that kind of meeting yet, maybe this book in the hands of the pastor or the music minister could be a reason for them to come together. And we want to have certain benedictions, or we want to go a certain direction with the litany, perhaps. Can we look at this book together and either decide, let's use this one or that one, or let's write one patterned after this? So I hope it might either facilitate conversations or even spark or begin conversation between whoever's going to be proclaiming through preaching and who's going to be proclaiming through music.
You make some really great suggestions about how to use poetry and encourage use of poetry. Can you talk about that a little bit and some of your ideas about the best ways to incorporate poetry in worship?
What I put forth in the book is a combination of concept of how poetry, again, can tune our ears, and then also the practical application of putting poetry in front of the people. I'm a musician first and foremost, and so I understand coming into a worship center, into a sanctuary, and there being music being played. I also know that there are a lot of screens used or worship bulletins of one sort or another. What if poetry could be used as sort of a visual or an internal prelude or call to worship, or inviting people into the gathering time of worship? What if when they gathered, there's a poem on the screen or a poem in a handout, a poem somewhere? What if that same poem shows up at the end or is still in their hands after they've had this entire worship service, and now it means maybe something different to them, for a poem to be the worship guide? Maybe if it's free church or liturgical approach is flexible enough for this, that it designates the poem in its lines or its stanzas could designate different kinds of segments of the morning that lies ahead, and then at the end it's presented, or at the beginning. So I think there are practical ways to put the poetry in front of the people. Maybe the poetry that's going to apply, that you think will apply for the day, is blown up a little bit in actual size on an easel when you walk into the narthex, to the entranceway. Maybe, what is this poem? And they get a handout that's that same poem for them to just look at and think about throughout the worship service. And as the worship goes along, it starts to blossom. It starts to come into being. What I try to accomplish, and however the poetry is given to them, however they're made aware of the poetry, is for it to create an image, that the image is transferred from my head and heart into their head and heart, and then it blossoms. It comes to life in their experience inside them, and thus becomes theirs. And if it's theirs, they're going to remember it a bit more. And if it's theirs, it will be the new hermeneutic, if you will, through which they process today's worship service.
Mhm.
So I don't know if I'm getting to that or not, but get it in front of the people in whatever ways can tune their ears and their eyes to poetry, tune their heart to embrace, not to manipulate them or to program them, but because it's poetry, it just gets them kind of hearing these words and these concepts. And then as the worship goes along, the poetry starts to, again, become theirs inside their head and heart.
Yeah. We published a piece quite a while back that John Ferguson wrote, in which he talked about that congregations function in layers. And so that sometimes a familiar tune with unfamiliar words will spark something. Or I could see the poetry being that kind of a layering, in a way, of the worship service. It lays there underneath or is inserted in a very creative way. So I think it's just a wonderful tool. So, well, thank you very much for taking time to talk to us about this. I think this is a wonderful resource that people will find to be very useful and maybe kick off ideas on their own. So thank you very much for this.
My privilege, indeed, my privilege. And thank you, Mark, for the opportunity. I appreciate it very much.